It was 1985, and I was 26 years old, standing at the crossroads of my career, hoping for that one big break. My name is Jack Sullivan, and I was a freelance journalist at the time, always on the lookout for stories that would set me apart from the countless other reporters chasing after mundane headlines. I didn't care for the usual fluff, puff pieces, or celebrity gossip. I wanted to uncover the dark truths, the stories that people would talk about for years. Stories like the ones whispered about Willow Creek. It all started on a muggy Friday night at a local dive bar. I was nursing a beer at the counter when I overheard an old man named Roy talking to someone about the Henshaw house. I didn't think much of it at first, but his voice, hoarse from years of smoking and drinking, caught my attention. It was the sort of thing that drew me in, the kind of talk that sounded half crazy, half intriguing. "Have you heard about the Henshaw house?" Roy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man he was talking to nodded and muttered something, but I couldn't hear the response over the hum of the jukebox. Roy's eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp, and they locked onto me. "Kid," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "you ever hear of the Henshaw house on Willow Creek?" I shook my head. Should I have? Roy gave a low chuckle, his face flickering with something between fear and excitement. "That place, it's cursed, I'm telling you. A family of 5 disappeared there, just vanished without a trace. No bodies, no nothing. The cops couldn't solve it. Still can't. It's been years, 10 years, but people still talk about it, and not in a good way." I wasn't one to take stock in rumors or ghost stories, but something about the way Roy spoke struck a chord in me. Missing people? A mystery buried in the hills of Willow Creek? That sounded like a real story, a story I could sink my teeth into. I leaned forward, asking him more about it. But the more Roy spoke, the less I understood. It was all pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Details that sounded like they were pulled from a bad horror movie. "People say it's cursed," he murmured again, eyeing me with a strange intensity. "You go in there, you don't come out the same. Or you don't come out at all." I tried to brush him off, telling myself it was just the ramblings of an old man. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. A family gone without a trace, a house left abandoned. Cursed or not, it seemed like exactly the kind of story I was looking for. I spent the next few days digging for more information. Roy's story wasn't entirely accurate. Yes, a family had disappeared in 1975, but no one knew exactly what happened. The Henshaws, Mark, Susan, and their 3 children, had simply vanished from their home on Willow Creek Road. There had been rumors of foul play, maybe even a ritualistic killing, but the evidence was scarce. The police investigation had gone cold, and over time the case faded from the headlines. I decided to pay the Henshaw house a visit. If there was something to uncover, I would find it. Willow Creek Road was miles from the nearest town. It was one of those forgotten stretches of land that time had passed over, the kind of place people only talked about in hushed voices. I could feel the tension in the air as I drove down that lonely road, the trees on either side of me growing denser, their branches twisting together like fingers, blocking out the sky. When I finally saw the Henshaw house, I almost wished I hadn't. It stood there like a monument to something dark and tragic, a hollow shell of what it once was. The house looked abandoned, just like in the pictures I'd seen. 2 stories tall, with chipped white paint peeling off the wooden boards. The windows were shattered, some covered by plywood. The front door hung on one hinge, swaying slightly in the breeze. I parked my car and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel of the overgrown driveway. A chill crawled up my spine, but I ignored it. I had a job to do. As I approached the house, the silence weighed down on me like a thick blanket. The air smelled stale, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. I snapped a few photos of the exterior before stepping inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and the smell of decay and mold hit me immediately. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I moved further into the house. The living room was a mess, furniture upturned and covered in dust, old photographs scattered across the floor. I bent down to inspect them, but the faces were blurred and faded. Nothing that could give me a clear picture of the family that had lived here. As I moved through the house, I felt as if I were walking through the remnants of a nightmare. Every corner seemed to hold something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it wasn't until I made it to the kitchen that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, stretching across the room like dark fingers. I told myself it was my imagination running wild, nothing more than the house's own oppressive atmosphere getting to me. I started to head toward the stairs when I noticed a door tucked behind a curtain in the corner of the living room. It was small and unassuming, but something about it caught my attention. I felt drawn to it. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled the door open. It led to a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness. The air was colder down there. My flashlight flickered as I stepped cautiously down the stairs, the beams of light cutting through the heavy darkness. The basement was larger than I expected, the walls lined with broken furniture, old boxes, and discarded items. But it was what lay in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. A circle had been drawn on the floor, crudely, with something that looked like charcoal. Inside the circle were strange symbols, jagged and unsettling. As I knelt to take a closer look, I felt something brush against my shoulder. My flashlight flickered once again, and in the brief moment of darkness, I heard a soft whisper, a voice, indistinct but clearly there. "Get out." My heart raced. I spun around, but no one was there. The whispering stopped as quickly as it had started, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I backed away from the circle, my legs trembling beneath me. As I did, I noticed something else on the walls. Small handprints, child-sized handprints smeared with something dark. My stomach churned. Was it blood or something else? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. The floorboards creaked. Footsteps. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the footsteps continued, slow, deliberate. I turned to flee, but when I reached for the basement door, it wouldn't open. I tugged at the handle, but it was stuck, as if someone, was holding it shut from the other side. Panic surged through me. My flashlight died, and the room was plunged into complete darkness. My breath quickened, and I could hear the sound of something, or someone, moving in the dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, a cold wind swept through the basement, and the door finally gave way. I bolted, my heart hammering in my chest as I sprinted up the stairs, through the house, and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I never wrote the story. The photos I took came out completely blank. My notes were a disjointed mess of nonsensical scribbles. I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. Roy, the man who'd first told me about the house, disappeared a few weeks later. And the Henshaw house? It burned down mysteriously not long after my visit. Even now, I can't escape it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear those whispers, and I know, deep down, that whatever was in that house is still out there, waiting.
Been the type to mind my own business. Raised that way, you know? Don't get involved. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try to stay out of it, life has a way of pulling you in. This is the story of how I got pulled into something I never saw coming. It all started about 12 years ago, when I moved into the house on Elm Street. I had just gone through a messy divorce, and I was looking for a fresh start, a place where I could rebuild. The house was small, with a faded yellow paint job and ivy creeping up one side. It wasn't much, but it was mine. At first, everything was peaceful. I spent my days unpacking, trying to create a sense of normalcy. It wasn't until a few months in that I noticed something strange. You know that feeling you get when you're not alone, like someone's watching you from across the room, even though you're the only one there? I kept getting that feeling. It wasn't all the time, but often enough that it made me uneasy. I thought it was just the stress of the divorce, the weight of being alone. But then came the knocking. One evening, while I was in the kitchen making dinner, I heard it, a soft knock on the front door. I froze. It was odd because I hadn't heard anyone approach. I didn't get visitors, especially not at that hour. I peered through the peephole, but no one was there. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I convinced myself I was imagining things and went back to cooking, but it didn't stop there. The next night, it happened again. Soft, rhythmic knocks. Same time, same place. I checked the door, the porch, but still nothing. No one was there. Now, I've always been a practical woman, so I dismissed it. Maybe it was kids playing pranks, or some random passerby. But deep down, I started feeling that pull. Something was wrong. And it only got worse when I started hearing whispers. It started softly at first, just a murmur from the back of the house. I thought maybe it was the neighbors, but no. The sounds were coming from within my own walls. I tried to rationalize it. Pipes, settling foundation, you know the drill. But one night, as I lay in bed, I could hear the whispers again, clearer now. And they were saying my name. Joan. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't asleep yet, but I was frozen in place. My name, spoken in a voice that wasn't my own. I called out, but no one answered. I grabbed the phone, ready to dial the police, but something stopped me. I wish I had called, because what happened next changed everything. The following day, I decided to do some research. I spent hours digging through old records at the local library. Elm Street wasn't a popular place for gossip, but when I finally found the file on my house, my blood ran cold. The previous owners, a couple named Tom and Mary Whitaker, had lived there for over 20 years. The file described a family, a happy, normal family. But the last entry was the one that caught my attention. It was from a police report dated 2 years before I moved in. The Whitakers had been reported missing. Neighbors said they hadn't been seen for weeks, and there was no sign of foul play, no evidence to suggest anything unusual. The police had closed the case, assuming they'd left town for some reason. But I knew in my gut something didn't add up. I needed to know more, so I went to the local library's archive to dig into old newspapers. I pulled up articles from around the time the Whitakers disappeared. Nothing, not a single word about their whereabouts. But one article did catch my eye. An unrelated story about a string of disappearances in the area, all centered around Elm Street. It had been written off as coincidence by the authorities. But now that I had a little more information, it didn't feel like one. I became obsessed. I started visiting the house at odd hours, looking for any clue, anything to explain the whispers. And then I found it. In the basement, hidden behind a false wall, I found old photographs. Some were of the Whitakers, smiling and happy, but others were black and white photos, some blurred, others sharp, each one showing a person standing by the front door of my house. The same door where I had heard the knocks. The same door where I had felt that terrible sense of being watched. There were dozens of these photos, spanning decades. Some of the people in the photos were still around. Some had disappeared over the years. But one name stood out, a woman named Emma Lawson. She had lived on Elm Street in the 1950s, and she had vanished without a trace. I found her name in the same newspaper archives I had already searched. But now, with this new context, it made my skin crawl. The more I researched, the more I learned about the history of the house. It wasn't just the Whitakers. There had been others too, people who lived on this street, on this very block, and then just disappeared, and the house was always involved. I went back to the house that night. I had to know. The whispers were louder now, almost urgent. I went into the basement, the place where I found the photos. The air was thick, cold. As I stood there, staring at the wall, I heard the knock again, this time from inside the house. The door to the basement creaked open, and standing there in the doorway was the figure of a man. Tall, thin, his face obscured by shadows. But his eyes, those eyes were the same as in the photographs. It was Tom Whitaker. I don't know how to explain it, but I know what I saw. The ghost of Tom Whitaker had come back to warn me, or maybe he wanted me to join them, the others who had disappeared. I moved out the next day. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I don't know if Tom Whitaker was ever really dead, or if the house itself was somehow feeding off the fear, the pain of the people who had lived there, but I don't care to find out. I've never been back, so if you're ever looking for a place to call home, stay far away from Elm Street. You might find yourself stuck there, like all the others. I know I'll never forget it, and maybe, just maybe, I hope you don't either.